Resonant frequencies? LFOs? Polar patterns? Oscillators? No, these words aren't a part of some alien language. They're essential vocabulary for music producers. Now, there's an absolute ton of jargon in music production that can make your head spin. But never fear, because today I'm here to decode the esoteric, define the unusual sounding, and describe 131 terms that every music producer should know. So buckle up, strap in, and keep all hands inside the vehicle. This is sure to be a long one. Going over 131 terms will take some time, but this video is designed to help, not to overwhelm. I've grouped similar terms together by relevant sections so you can jump to them using the chapter markers below. All of these terms come directly from the glossary in our newest ebook, The Beatmaker's Bible. I've distilled down the 131 terms that are actually worth your time. And as a thank you for stopping by in this video, I'm going to give you this whole ebook for free. It's got over 60,000 words, 50 hand-drawn pictures. It's a culmination of everything I've learned on my journey to becoming a full-time professional music producer. And it's the resource I wish I had when I was starting, and it's yours for free. You can download it from my website below. Be sure to use the code BeatmakersVocab to save $20 and download it for free. Let's dive in and discover the terms you need to know to start creating amazing music. And hey, if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and join the ever-growing community of future music legends. Starting off with section 1. The basics. This section is dedicated to everything I think you need to know if you know nothing about music production. In this section, to make things easier, everything's going to be in alphabetical order. Starting things off with audio interfaces. Audio interfaces are hardware used to convert analog signals into digital formats for recording, and vice versa for playback. They are essential in computer-based recording setups, and they often look like this, with some plugs on the front to plug in instruments or microphones, and some plugs on the back for speakers. Next up, audio plugins. Audio plugins are software tools that add or enhance audio functionality in your DAW, including effects like reverb, compression, or virtual instruments. We'll get into what those mean more in a second. Next up, we have automation. Automation is a feature in DAWs allowing for dynamic control of parameters like volume, pan, and effects over time within the track. That could be volume, pan, or effects. Most commonly, automation is used to automate volume, making one part of the track a little bit quieter, making the next part of the track a little bit louder depending on what you need. Next up, we have aux sends. Aux sends are routing tools in a mixer that allow sending of audio signals to external processors or separate group channels for effects or group processing. Basically, you can think of this as another pit stop before it goes out on the stereo output. Next up, we have BPM. BPM stands for beats per minute, and it's a measure of tempo in music, or how fast or how slow the song is. Next up, we have the browser or the library. In most DAWs, this is where users can browse, organize, access samples, loops, plugins, and other media. Most DAWs come with a plethora of library elements that you can choose to change your sound, to get good presets, and to get some good sounding sounds right off the bat. Next up, we have bus, which is very similar to that aux sends track I said before. Bus is a channel in a mix or DAW that combines multiple audio tracks for collective processing or routing. Basically, you're creating another audio track that your sound is going to stop at before it goes to the stereo output. Moving along, we have channels. Channels are individual paths for routing audio signals in a mixer or DAW. Each channel is really similar to each track that you have in your recording. The channel strip is where you put your plugins and what order they go in. Next up, we have click track. A click track is a metronome. If you don't know what that is, it is used during the recording process to help musicians maintain a constant tempo. A click track will click to the beats of the BPM that you have your track set at. Next up, we have compression. Compression is an essential music production technique that often gets misconstrued. Compression reduces the volume of loud sound and therefore makes soft sounds sound louder. It narrows the dynamic range of an audio source, making the soft parts closer to the loud parts. Compression is essential for being able to hear every single nuance of a sound. Next up, we have DAW. I know I've been throwing this word around a lot, but it actually means Digital Audio Workstation. This is the software that you'll use to record, edit, mix, and produce your audio files. Some of the biggest players in the game would be Ableton, Logic, FL Studio, Pro Tools, etc., etc. I've heard some of those software names. Those are referring to DAWs. Next up, we have EQ, or equalization. EQ is the process of altering the frequencies of an audio signal by boosting, cutting, or flattening certain frequencies. Every sound that we use is going to have a lot of frequencies across the frequency spectrum, and we can use EQ to solo some of those high sounds and get rid of some of those low sounds, or vice versa. In my mind, EQ and compression are the de facto essential tools for music production. Next up, we have faders. Faders are the sliding controls that you have on your mixing console in your DAW that is used to adjust the amplitude or the volume of your audio tracks. Moving along, we have filter. Filter is an audio processing tool that removes or reduces certain frequencies from an audio signal. Filters are similar to EQ in the fact that they get rid of certain EQ frequencies and boost others. But oftentimes filters are used with modulation or automation to get unique sounds that the filters change over time. I'll get into that more later in the sound design section. We've talked about EQ, we've talked about filters, but we should also mention frequency. Frequencies are the rate at which an audio signal vibrates, which is measured in hertz or Hz. This determines the pitch of the sound. Higher sounds will have faster sound waves and higher frequencies. Lower sounds will have longer sound waves and lower frequencies. Next up, we have gear acquisition syndrome, abbreviated as gas. Now, let me tell you, producers have some bad gas. Gear acquisition syndrome is just the thought that buying more and more expensive gear is going to make your sound that much better. To a point, yes, it will. Buying gear will increase your sound quality. However, it's not the end-all be-all. The most important thing for music production is you, the producer. Don't get caught up in buying all the shiny new toys. Promise it's not going to help unless you have the skills already. Next up, we have the golden rule of music production. The golden rule of music production is simple. If it sounds good, it is good. It emphasizes the importance of a listener's experience or emotional connection over technical perfection in music production. Just because you watched a video and someone told you to do something doesn't mean you should do it. If it sounds weird in your mix, it's going to sound weird to the listener. Next up, we have headphones. Now, you know what headphones are, but headphones can be a little bit different when it comes to music production. We have two main types, closed back and open back. Closed back are great for recording. They're not going to allow any audio to leak out, whereas open back are great for mixing. They allow for a more accurate representation of how you hear sounds when they actually hit your ear, not from a headphone. Next up, we have the term in the box. In the box means working entirely within a computer using digital audio workstations and software. This is a stark contrast to how we used to do things, where everything was analog and you had to have a physical mixing board and physical preamps and so forth. Most mixing nowadays is done in the box or on the computer. Next up, we have metronome. Metronome is a click track, but I just wanted to reiterate it because it is that important, and I wanted you to know that it is the same thing. Next up, we have microphone. Now, you know what a microphone is, but there are many types of microphones that you should probably check out if you're a music producer. The kind that I'm using right now is called a dynamic microphone. Dynamic microphones are great for loud, explosive, transient-rich sounds. When the other one that you'll probably use is called a condenser microphone. Condenser microphones are great for picking up all of the nuances of a sound. They generally have a lot more high end than their dynamic counterparts. Normally, you'll use condensers for recording vocals or live instruments, whereas dynamic microphones might work better for something like drums. Next up, we have MIDI. M-I-D-I. That's pretty close to MADI, but not nearly as cool if you ask me. MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. MIDI is a protocol that allows electronic musical instruments, computers, and other equipment to communicate and synchronize. MIDI is the protocol that allows me to play the keys from my keyboard right here, and it to go into my DAW, and then it can be changed into any sound that I choose. Speaking of keyboards, that brings me into my next term, MIDI controller. A MIDI controller is a device that generates and transmits MIDI data. It often looks like a keyboard because that is how MIDI is based off of, the piano keyboard. Next up, we have the mixer. Back in the day, the mixer used to be that giant console that you had with a bunch of different faders, each representing a different track. Nowadays, most DAWs have their own version of that with their own software mixers. The mixer is generally used to adjust volume, combine, process, and use it to mix the song that we'll do. We'll get more into mixing in the mixing section down below. Moving right along, we have modulation. Modulation is changing or varying a sound parameter over time, such as pitch, volume, to add interest and movement to the sound. Modulation can make a sound go from the left speaker to the right speaker, all with the BPM of your song. Modulation is also responsible for that really crazy synth sound that you've been lusting after. Continuing on, we have mono. Mono simply means a single audio channel, where the same signal is sent to both the left and right speakers, or headphones or monitors. This is different than stereo, where each left and right speaker has a different audio signal that you're sending you. Most phones are in mono. They only send one signal. This is important to keep in mind as we're doing our mix. We need to make sure that it sounds good in mono. Next up, we have mute and solo button. Mute is exactly how it sounds. Click mute on your DAW and that track will no longer be played, or you'll no longer be able to hear it. Click solo and that track will be the only track that you'll be able to hear. Next up, we have plugin. Plugins are software that adds specific audio processing capabilities in a DAW, like effects, reverb, or even virtual instruments. Next up, we have presets. Presets are pre-configured settings for audio processors, synthesizers, and other things in your music DAW. They allow users to quickly achieve specific sounds or effects without knowing any real knowledge behind them. For example, we here at Music by Maddie have released a vocal preset pack that you can just drag and drop onto your vocals to get professional sounding vocals. Shameless plug. Next up, we have the rack or the channel strip. I mentioned channels earlier, and this is the same thing. However, oftentimes a rack is referring to the physical rack that things like EQs, compressors, preamps all sit on in a music studio. But now, because most things are in the box, racks can also refer to the channel strip that's on your track. Some DAWs use different nomenclature for it, so just keep that in mind. Next up, we have reverb. Reverb is an effect that simulates the natural reverberations of a sound in a physical space. It adds depth and ambiance to audio recordings. Reverb is, in my opinion, one of the top plugins that a producer can learn. Moving along, we have stereo. Stereo is an audio format where sound is recorded and played back using two channels, the left and right. This creates a sense of width and space. This is different than the single channel called mono. Mono. M-O-N-O. Next up, we have studio monitors. Studio monitors are loudspeakers specifically designed for audio production. They provide an accurate and flat response for critical listening during mixing and mastering. They are not designed to color the sound like something like consumer-grade headphones might be. They won't distort the bass, they won't add any extra frequencies. They're there so you can get an accurate picture of what your sound actually sounds like. Continuing on, we have timeline view. Now, timeline view is just the specific view that you have in your digital audio workstation that displays the sequential arrangement of tracks along a temporal grid. Usually the grids have lines that are aligned to the BPM. This aids in editing and arranging your song so that you can put everything together after you've recorded it. Next up, we have track. A track is a single layer of audio or a musical element in a recording. Each time you record an instrument or a different voice, you'll add a different track. Tracks can also be considered buses, so sometimes they're just used for processing and effects, but that's a little bit more advanced. Next up, we have the transport controls. Transport refers to the set of controls in a digital audio workstation that are used for playback, recording, and navigating through a track, aka play, stop, rewind, and fast forward. And finally, finishing off our basic section of music production jargon, we come to waveform. Waveform is the visual representation of an audio signal, showing the amplitude of the sound wave over time. If you've ever been on SoundCloud, that thing that you're seeing is the waveform of the entire song together. Probably seen these before if they are common. All right, that's a wrap on section 1. All of those things are some of the basic things you might need to know to get started in music production. There's a lot there, but now let's get into some other things by moving on to section 2 in songwriting. Once again, throughout this songwriting section, all of the terms will be in alphabetical order. The first term I want to talk about is called the bridge. A bridge is a section of the song that provides contrast to the rest of the song. It often occurs in the middle or the middle to the end of the song, and it gives the ears a break of everything that they were listening to before and keeps things interesting before going back into, say, the last chorus or the solo. Now, this is a bit of a unique one, but I really like it a lot, so I'm going to teach you it now. It's called caesura. Caesura is referring to a complete pause or break in a piece of music, and it's often used for dramatic effect. It's one of my favorite ways to hook in listeners by cutting out everything all at once, just for a split second, so that they're that much more intrigued when it actually drops. Next up, we have chorus. Now, this is one that you've probably heard before. Chorus actually refers to two things. In this case, in the songwriting context, it means the repeatable section of the song that people often sing and then it gets stuck in your head. But it's also an audio effect that's used to create a thicker sound by duplicating the signal and adding in some modulation to the sound. For this section, though, it's the part that people repeat. You know what I'm talking about. Next up, we have crescendos. A crescendo is a gradual increase in the loudness or intensity in a piece of music. And as you're songwriting, that's important to do. Crescendo into the parts that are more intense. And then bring the volume down in the parts that are less intense. This creates an emotional connection with the listener, and they'll want to continue to listen. Opposite of crescendo, we have decrescendo, otherwise known as diminuendo. This is a gradual decrease in the loudness or the intensity of a piece. Moving along, we have fill. A fill is kind of what it sounds like. You're filling in the gaps of your musical part, normally with drums, aka drum fill. This helps lead listeners into different song sections of the song itself and helps keep things interesting. Next up, we have the intro of a song. This is the beginning section of a track, setting the tone and preparing the listener for the main part of the song. And then we also have the outro. The outro is the ending section of a track that provides a conclusion. This can be a fade out, it can be a poignant last line. Sometimes it's just the vocals taking over and singing so that it echoes in your mind forever. And next up, we have one of my favorite sections, the pre-chorus. The pre-chorus is a section in the song that leads into the chorus. It often builds intention and the anticipation, and it sets itself apart from the verse by changing up the chord structure oftentimes or changing up the melody. Another thing to keep in mind as you're songwriting is called the rule of three. Now, this is a guideline in general music production, but it's important to think about as you're crafting your song in the songwriting stage. It suggests that three elements like a bass line, a melody, and a rhythm are often enough to create full and engaging sounds. Go listen to your favorite tracks of all time and try to determine how many things are going on at once. Is it a melody, rhythm, and backing track? How many elements are there, and how many do you actually need to create a full sounding track? I'm guessing the answer is less than you think. And moving on to one of the worst parts about songwriting, writer's block. Writer's block is a common challenge faced by creatives, not just in music production, but any creative endeavor. This happens when one experiences a temporary inability to produce new work, come up with new ideas. This can really suck, but I promise, persevere and you can get over it. Okay, that brings us to a close for section number 2 of this vocabulary extravaganza. In the next section, we're going to talk about something that's extremely important that most music producers don't even bat an eye to. It's acoustics. Let me teach you some vocabulary related to acoustics and acoustics in your room that you'll need to know to get the best sound possible. The first term I'll teach you in this section is acoustic treatment. Acoustic treatment is the process of modifying a room to improve its sound characteristics. This typically involves the use of absorptive and diffusing materials to control the reflections and reverberations that happen from your speakers. Next up, we have acoustics. Acoustics is the science of sound and its behavior in an environment. It's crucial to understand a little bit about how sound waves interact within a room or recording space if you want to get the best results possible. Next up, we have the angle of first reflection. This is the point where direct sound from a source, like a speaker, first reflects on a wall or a different surface before reaching the listener. This is one of the most important points in room acoustics and speaker placement because this is where the first acoustic panel ideally should be placed. Moving along to reflections. Reflections are sound waves that bounce off surfaces, aka walls, ceilings, and floors before finally reaching the listener. These affect the acoustics of a recording or listening environment. Too many reflections in your recording is going to be hard to process later. It's also going to trick your brain into hearing sounds that may not exist when it comes to the mixing and mastering process. Having a few reflections is fine, but having too many is going to degrade your sound. Next up, we have resonant frequencies. Resonant frequencies are frequencies at which a room or object naturally vibrate. This can lead to an amplification or attenuation of certain sound frequencies. Next up, we have room modes. Room modes are resonant frequencies specific to the dimensions of a room. This can lead to uneven frequency response and acoustic problems. Room modes happen when sound waves and reflections bounce off and into each other, and they cause gaps in the frequency spectrum. This can cause your brain to hear inaccurate sounds. Moving along, we have soundproofing. Soundproofing is the process of making a room resistant to the transmission of external noise and also reduces the sound leakage from within. This is really essential for controlled recording environments, especially in big cities. Soundproofing is the reason why your neighbor's dog Fido doesn't get recorded into your microphone and your voice does. Proper soundproofing is really expensive and often has to be done with constructing the room itself. So for most music producers, I recommend acoustic treatment rather than soundproofing. Next up, we have standing waves. Standing waves are sound waves that resonate in a room at certain frequencies. This creates peaks and nulls in the room's frequency response, and it can lead to acoustic issues. Very similar to room modes. Next up, we'll be moving into section 4, which will be the recording part of this. Recording is absolutely essential for any music producer. If you're trying to record vocals, you're trying to record drums, you're trying to record any instrument, you need to know some of these techniques and terms before getting started. Let's hop in. Starting off with ambience. Ambience is the character or atmosphere of a sound environment. It's typically captured by recording the natural reverberations and reflections in a space. Next up, we have ambient miking. Ambient miking is the technique of recording where microphones are placed at a distance from the sound source to capture that room ambient or natural reverberation. This oftentimes leads to better results than trying to emulate it with reverb later, but it gives less choices down the line. The next term is cardioid polar pattern. Cardioid polar pattern is a pattern characterized by high sensitivity at the front and sides and significantly less at the back. This is ideal for isolating sound sources. If I were to turn my microphone around, la 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 la, you can hear me, but it's not nearly as clear. That is a cardioid polar pattern at work. Moving along, we have clipping. Clipping is a form of distortion that occurs when an audio signal exceeds the maximum level that a piece of equipment can handle. Let me demonstrate on this microphone really quick. If I turn this up all the way, all of a sudden my voice starts getting distorted. This is because the audio signal is coming in too hot. So the tops of it are actually getting clipped off and back to normal. Clipping is not a good thing to experience. You can't do anything after the fact to take away that clipping that happens in the first place. Moving on, we have close miking. Close miking just refers to placing a microphone near the sound source, typically within a few inches. This is to capture direct, detailed sound with minimal room noise. This is really great for dynamic microphones especially. Notice how close I'm getting to the microphone here. This is an example itself of close miking. Moving along, we have condenser microphones. Condenser microphones are microphones that use a capacitor to convert acoustic energy into an electrical signal. They are known for their sensitivity and wide frequency response, especially in the high end. They're ideal for studio recording and live instruments. They differ from dynamic microphones. Dynamic microphones are robust, versatile microphones that use moving coil magnetic diaphragms to convert sound into electrical signal. Now that's fancy talk, but really what you need to know is that they're great for live performances. They're great for especially transient sounds like drums. Now we talked about a cardioid polar pattern, but there's also some other polar patterns that you should know about. One of them is a figure 8. A figure 8 works like the cardioid polar pattern like this, but it also extends the back as well. This is great if you're recording two vocalists at one time. Moving along, we have the inverse square law. The inverse square law is a principle stating that the intensity of sound diminishes as the distance from the sound source increases. This is crucial for understanding microphone placement and room acoustics. Check out how much quieter I get the farther back I get from this microphone. Hey there. How's it going? That's the inverse square law in action. Moving along, we have layering. Layering combines multiple sounds or recordings to create a fuller, more complex audio element. Now, this can be used in any stage of the music production process, but I bring it up in the recording process because oftentimes you record before you start mixing or producing the song. If that's the case, it's important to record multiple takes of instruments so that you can pan maybe one left, one right, one down the middle, and add some thickness to your otherwise thin recordings. Next up, we have multi-takes. Multi-takes is what it sounds like. It's where you record multiple versions or takes of the same part, allowing for selection or comping of the best performance in the mix. With multi-takes, you can pick and choose your favorite parts and put them all into one super take. Moving along, we have natural resonance. Natural resonance are the inherent frequencies that a physical object or space naturally amplifies or resonates. This impacts the sound's character. The natural resonance of a bathroom is different than the natural resonance of a studio, in that all matters when you actually record into your microphone. Back into some polar patterns. Now we have something called an omnidirectional polar pattern. Not like a cardioid pattern or a figure 8 pattern. An omnidirectional picks up frequencies equally from all sides. This is really great if you're recording, let's say, 8 singers in a circle, all shooting towards the microphone. That would be where you'd use an omnidirectional polar pattern. Now, it wouldn't be right for me to talk about recording vocab without talking about phase. Phase is the relationship in time between waveforms. That brings me into phase issues. Phase issues occur when audio waveforms are out of sync. Phase issues happen when one valley of a waveform directly meets with another peak of another. Those cancel out to no sound at all. This can cause really big problems. Oftentimes you won't hear no sound, but you'll just hear a hollow sound when you have two recordings that aren't in phase. Moving along, we're talking about polar patterns. Polar patterns are the shape of the microphone's sensitivity field. It determines how well it picks up sound from different directions. For example, the cardioid, omnidirectional, or the figure 8. Now, up next, we have the proximity effect. The proximity effect is an increase in low frequency response when a sound is close to a microphone. This often results in a bass sounding heavy or boomy. Notice how much deeper my voice sounds when I'm right up on the microphone than when I'm right here. There you go. Now we've talked about dynamic, we've talked about condenser microphones, but there's also another one called ribbon. Ribbon microphones are a type of microphone that use a thin metal ribbon to generate sound. They're known for their natural warm sound and characteristics. These were often used way back in the day. I often associate them with 50s and 60s type rockabilly sound. Ribbon microphones are often really expensive, and I wouldn't recommend them for beginning music producers, but they are a unique and cool sound to add to your arsenal if you can. Next up, we have sibilance. Sibilance is the excessive or harsh high frequency sounds produced by S and sh, often in vocals. These can also be from t, t's, Ks. They can be addressed specifically by a plugin called a de-esser. Next up, we have timbre. Timbre is the characteristic quality or the color of a sound that makes it distinct from every other sounds, even if they have the same pitch and loudness. A good way to think about timbre is think of two different people singing the same notes. The reason they sound different is because their timbres are different, and that is true of any instrument. All right, wrapping up to the last one in the recording section, we have the XY technique. This is a stereo microphone technique where two cardioid mics are placed at a 90-degree angle to each other. This provides a balanced stereo image with good mono capability and not that many phase problems. A win-win-win. This is really great for getting some ambience and getting a stereo sound from your otherwise mono track. But that will wrap up our section on recording. Let's move into something a little bit more juicy than recording, and let's go into the sound design part. All right, moving on to section 4, sound design. Before we hop in, I gotta take off my jacket, I'm burning. All right, good to go. Sound design, here we come. Let's start off with ADSR. ADSR stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. These are parameters used to shape the envelope of the sound, or just how a sound sounds. This is used particularly in synthesizers and samples. Now, I just mentioned envelope, but let's discover what it means. Envelope, in sound design and synthesis, is the shape of a sound's ASDR. Basically, the way that we shape the waveform to sound like what we want it to. Let's move on to LFO. LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. It's an electronic frequency used in synthesizers to modulate parameters like pitch, amplitude, filter cutoff, or other effects. It's not actually a sound, it's usually just tuned to the BPM of the song and used to create effects that synchronize to the tempo of a song. While we're creating synths, you might run into the word monophonic. Monophonic is a sound that plays one note at a time. When you're creating a synthesizer that's monophonic, you're probably using a bass synthesizer or a lead where you don't want it to play more than one note at the same time. Moving on to oscillators. Oscillators are components in synthesis that generate periodic waveforms to create sound. They are absolutely fundamental to sound creation in synthesizers. The most common waveforms that oscillators use are sine, saw, triangle, and square. Now, if you create a sound, you may want to create something called a pad. A pad is a synthesized sound with a soft, sustained quality. It's often used for creating ambience, background, or harmonies. Now, another type of sound you might want to create if you're using a synthesizer is a pluck. Plucks are often characterized by their sharp, percussive sounds. They are commonly used in electronic music, and they almost always have a quick attack and decay. So on one hand, you had monophonic sounds, but on the other hand, you have polyphony or polyphonic sounds. Polyphonic refers to the capability of an instrument to play multiple notes simultaneously. Like I said before, this is the opposite of monophonic, which can only play one note at a time. Another parameter you might want to know in synthesizers is called portamento, which is otherwise known as glide. Portamento is a feature on synthesizers and other instruments that smoothly glides from one pitch or one note to another. It creates a nice kind of whoop up transition depending on how many milliseconds you set it at. Now let's talk about what is sound design itself. Sound design is the art and practice of creating, manipulating, and integrating audio elements to enhance the overall sonic character of your music or your film or your games or other media. It's not specific to music production itself, but when you say sound design in music production, I tend to think about creating sounds from scratch, which for the most part is synthesizers. All right, and that will do it for this short part on sound design. There are a lot more words that you probably might need to know if you're getting more into the weeds of things, but for now, this is a great starting point for you to have. Let's hop into the next section where we'll learn some vocab related to editing and gain staging our our tracks before we actually throw them into our DAW and mix them and master them. First word I want to talk about is amplitude. Amplitude is the strength or level of a sound signal that's typically measured in decibels or dBs. This represents the loudness or the volume, just another word for it. Next up, we have clip gain. Clip gain is adjusting the level of an individual audio clip independently of the track's main volume control. Clip gain is pre-fader. That means you can adjust the volume of your track before it goes into any plugins, and then afterwards, the fader is used to mix it into taste later. Now, while you're editing, you're inevitably going to use a crossfade. A crossfade is a technique where two audio tracks are blended together, with one track's volume decreasing while the other increases, commonly used in transitions to make them seamless. Now, this can also be used like crossfading, which I think of as more of two DJs or one DJ blending two tracks together by putting them with that crossfade. Next up, we have dBFS, which is decibels relative to full scale. dBFS is a unit of measurement for digital audio levels, where 0 dBFS is the maximum possible digital level. This is what most DAWs are defaulting to nowadays. 0 is the default highest, and anything above that gets clipped off. Let's define editing. Editing is the process of selecting, modifying, and arranging audio segments in a DAW. Sometimes when you have recordings, you might have blips, clicks, you might have multiple takes to stitch together, and editing is the process where you take all of those and make them sound like one flawless take. Get rid of any extra parts that you might not need. This also can involve pitch correction. It can involve going back to the recording stage and redoing some stuff. But this part is where you figure out everything and make everything sound really good. In editing, you'll probably use a technique called fade ins or fade outs. This is where you gradually increase or decrease the volume of an audio track to smoothly transition in or out. Rather than having an abrupt start or stop, you can just take that volume and fade it in and fade it out. Moving along, we have gain staging. Gain staging is the process of managing the levels of audio signals within the recording and mixing process to avoid distortion and maintain audio quality. If you record too low, you have to bring that signal up and you'll get noise. If you record too hot, you'll get clipping and distortion that you don't want. Gain staging is about finding the happy medium. It's also great to get the gain staging right in the editing phase, so that when you get to the mixing phase and the mastering phase, you'll be good to go. A big part about gain staging has to do with headroom. Headroom is the amount of available space or leeway before reaching the maximum level, which is 0 dBFS. This allows for dynamic range without clipping. Next up, we have region gain. Now, region gain is pretty much clip gain, but different DAWs call it different things. Region gain is adjusting the volume level of a specific section or region of an audio track within your DAW. It's similar to the clip gain as in its pre-processing, pre-fader. Now, while you're editing, you may come across some stuff that needs spectral repair. Spectral repair is a process that in audio restoration that involves fixing or removing problematic frequencies or noise from recording. This often uses advanced software and tools, but spectral, it's a cool word, so I want to throw it in here. Now, while you're editing and gain staging, one thing that you'll have to check constantly is your stereo output. The stereo output is the final two-channel, left and right, audio output that is the result of mixing multiple tracks. This is your final volume bus where everything comes together. Now, during editing, you may also want to alter the time of each individual track. This is called time stretching. Time stretching is altering the duration of an audio sample without changing its pitch. It's commonly used for tempo matching in remixes and electronic music. Some DAWs also have time stretching available to quantize your audio tracks to the beat. So that can help with any timing problems that you have in your song. Now, another way of measuring loudness that you might not have heard of before is called a VU meter. A VU is the more old school way and visual representation of showing audio levels. It's a bit advanced, but I just wanted to introduce it to you. Okay. All right, and that is this section on editing and gain staging. Those were quite a lot of terms once again, but now we're ready to hop into some meaty potatoes in this actual vocab that we're going over. And we're going to hop into mixing, and then we'll hop into mastering. So let's dive into section 7, mixing. All right, once again, we're going in alphabetical order, and I'm starting off with additive EQ. Additive EQ is an approach to EQ where frequencies are boosted to enhance certain characteristics of a sound, as opposed to subtractive EQ, which involves cutting frequencies. I often recommend sticking to subtracting or subtractive EQ rather than boosting sounds, because that's where coloration can come in and sounds can sound a bit weird. Next up, we have chopping. Chopping is a technique where a long audio clip is just divided into smaller sections or beats, usually for creative purposes. The most common way I hear these is with vocal chops, using different parts of the voice mashed together, melded together to create a unique melody. Moving on, we have delay and delay time. Delay is where you echo the sound over and over again to put it more in a space. And the delay time is the time it takes for that echo to repeat after the original sound. Moving along, we have denoisers. Denoisers are audio processing tools used to reduce or eliminate unwanted noise like a hiss or a hum from a recording. My favorite plugins for this are Isotope's RX suite. Next up, we have distortion. Now, distortion can be a bad thing if you're getting it because you're clipping, but it can also be a pleasant sound if applied in small doses. Adding subtle distortion can add some harmonic information, and it's often something I do to my tracks to give them a little bit more oomph. Next up, we have feedback, which specifically deals with delay. A delayed signal that is fed back into itself to create an echo or reverberation effect is the feedback. If you turn that feedback past 100%, you're going to hear that feedback feed into itself and make some really nasty sounding stuff. So just be careful with that. Okay, moving on to some of the frequency spectrum, we're talking about high end. The high end is the upper part of the audio frequency spectrum, which is typically about 6K and above. That includes some of the treble frequencies and clarity and the sparkle to the sound. Then we have the high mids, which is the higher mid-range frequencies, around 2K to 6K. This is crucial for the presence and intelligibility of many instruments and vocals. Next up, we have looping. Looping is repeating a segment of audio in a continuous cycle. It's often used in electronic music, music production, and even live performances. Back to the frequencies, now we're talking about low end. Low end is the lower part of the audio frequency spectrum, typically below 250 hertz. This encompasses the bass frequencies that provide depth and power and sound and the feeling that you get from that low end. And finally, we have the low mids when it comes to the frequencies. These are the lower mid-range frequencies. They go from about 250 hertz to around 2K, and they're important for the warmth and the body of most instruments in vocals. All right, that brings us into mixing itself. Mixing is the process of balancing, blending, and adjusting individual tracks within a recording to create a cohesive sound. Next up, we have noise gates. Noise gates are audio processors that mute or reduce the level of a signal when it falls below a set threshold. It's used to eliminate background noise or hum. The most common place I find myself using it is on the background guitars when I don't want that hum to be going on when they're not actually playing anything. Next up, we have pan knobs. Pan knobs are controls on the mixer or the DAW that are used to position the sound within the stereo spectrum. They can be left, they can be left middle, they can be completely left, right, you name it. This is all called panning. Panning is distributing the audio signal across the stereo field to create that sense of space and the direction of the mix. If you were hearing a band in real life, you wouldn't just hear everything coming at you directly, you'd hear music from everywhere. That's the point of panning. Now, while you're mixing, I often recommend using something called reference tracks. Reference tracks are professionally produced songs that are used as a benchmark to guide the mixing or mastering process. They help you ensure a similar level of quality and balance between your sounds. Sometimes getting locked into your song, you get blindsided to what an actual song should sound like. So having the reference track there can be a good guide. Next up, we have reverse sounds. Reverse sound is an effect where audio is played but reversed. This creates a unique and often ethereal sound texture, and it's one of my favorites to add into my songs and my productions. This is similar to, but different from, a riser. A riser is a sound effect that's used in electronic music to build tension, typically characterized by that crescendo that I mentioned earlier that leads into a climax or a drop. Next up, we have sample. Sample is a digital recording of a sound or musical phrase used in a building block in electronic music and sampling-based genres. Sample is just taking one section of one song that you like and putting it in your song. Sampling is the technique that uses these samples or recorded sounds in music production. Now, when you do use sampling, I often recommend manipulating the sound afterwards to make it your own by looping, pitch correcting, or chopping, or any number of things. Let's go back into EQ, specifically subtractive EQ. Subtractive EQ is the process of reducing or cutting certain frequencies using an equalizer to clean up a mix or to make room for other instruments. This is often what I recommend rather than adding frequencies because it results in a more natural sound. Let's go over transient. Transient is the initial attack phase of a sound. It represents the high energy, short duration burst typically found at the beginning of percussive sounds. Most sounds have at least a small transient. And that will do it for the mixing section of vocab. I've covered a lot of ground. I've been a lot of places. I've thrown a lot of vocabulary at you, and hopefully you're still hanging on for the ride. Now, you don't need to know all these to be a wonderful music producer, but knowing them is the first step in actually mastering them. And speaking of mastering, let's hop into section 8, mastering, where we cover the final vocab words that we're going to learn about today and round off our list where we finally hit 131 words. Now, if you don't know, mastering is that final process that you use before putting your song out into the internet interwebs or releasing it in a CD, whatever you want to do, just giving it to grandma on a thumb drive, you should probably master your song first. It's getting the loudness to where it needs to be, putting that final polish or finishing touches on your song so that it sounds professional. Let's dive into some vocab so you can learn more about it. Now, an advanced concept in mastering is called dithering. Dithering is the process applied to the final stage of mastering that adds a low level of noise to a digital audio file, which reduces the audible distortion when converting to a lower bit depth. Like I said, this is an advanced topic. It's not always necessary to add dithering on your tracks before mastering, but I just wanted to bring it up because if you've seen it and you didn't know what it is, there you go. Now we have mastering itself. Mastering itself is the final step in the music production process. It involves fine-tuning the mix's balance, enhancing the overall sound quality, adding to the stereo spectrum, maybe making it more punchy, and preparing it for audio distribution. Now, a lot of times in mastering, you'll be working with the stereo imaging of a track. This technique is how we manipulate sound in the stereo field. We can create a sense of width, depth, and placement of audio sources so that we can expand our listening capabilities and expand what we actually hear from our final song. And even more so than stereo, sometimes we have tracks that use spatial audio. Spatial audio is audio technology that creates multi-dimensional sound experience. Think about sitting in a movie theater. You have things that are coming up from under your seat sometimes, from the left, from the right, from way back here, from the front. That would be spatial audio, and my prediction is as we continue to go through the music journey, that's going to become more and more important. And the last one I want to throw in for mastering because it's so important is called limiting. Limiting is the process of bringing up your sound up to the relevant decibel that it needs to be. Limiting is similar to compression, but with a really high attack ratio. And it's the reason that you can bring something up without it clipping or sounding super distorted. Limiting is a huge part of mastering. So there you go, folks. 131 terms every music producer should know. Some of these concepts might be more like jello than concrete in your producer brain right now. Keep at it and keep learning. And these concepts will start to unfold themselves before your eyes. To help hammer down these terms even more, you can always download our ebook, The Beatmaker's Bible, to read more details about them. And remember to use the offer code BeatmakersVocab to get it for free. And note, this is just for the ebook and not the audiobook. If you have any questions about the mountain of vocabulary we just climbed, leave them in the comments below.